What happens when an everyday citizen stands up to the police, refusing to give in to their demands? Well, in today's story, we're diving into an intense encounter where one man handles a situation with the police like a pro. This isn't your typical confrontation. He's calm, collected, and fully aware of his rights, especially when they ask for his ID without just cause. As tensions rise and the officers start pushing harder, he stays firm, and the way he responds is a masterclass in handling this kind of situation. Will the officers back down, or will they escalate? And what happens when a routine interaction turns into a battle over personal rights? Stay tuned, because the twists are just beginning, and you won't want to miss how this all plays out. It all started when this man, who we'll call Mark, was simply going about his day, minding his own business. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking down the street when the officers pulled up. They immediately started questioning him, demanding his identification without giving a clear reason why. For Mark, this wasn't the first time he'd been stopped like this, and he knew exactly what his rights were. What made this situation different, though, was the way the officers handled it. They were aggressive, persistent, and clearly not backing down. Mark wasn't fazed. He calmly told them he had no obligation to provide his ID unless they had a valid reason, which they didn't. As the officers tried to intimidate him, he kept his cool, sticking to his stance. But with every passing minute, it was clear they weren't going to let him go that easily. What's their next move? As Mark stood his ground, the officers' frustration grew. One of them, Officer Davis, seemed particularly agitated. He kept repeating the same question, demanding Mark's ID, but still offered no real reason for it. Mark, unfazed, responded again, "I haven't broken any laws, and I'm not giving you my ID unless you have a reason." This wasn't just about a simple ID check anymore. For Mark, it was about something bigger. He knew that if he gave in now, it would send the message that police could just stop anyone at any time, no questions asked. His rights mattered more than a quick, easy way out of this situation. Meanwhile, Officer Davis and his partner, Officer Blake, were starting to get visibly upset. It was clear they weren't used to being challenged like this. From a bystander's perspective, things were heating up. People were starting to gather, watching the interaction unfold. Some murmured, some filmed, but there was a sense of unease. Would this escalate into something worse? The officers weren't backing down, and Mark wasn't either. The tension hung thick in the air. How far would this go? Would Mark's calmness be enough to keep the situation from exploding? As the minutes dragged on, Officer Davis grew more impatient, his voice rising with each passing second. "You're obstructing justice," he snapped. "If you don't give me your ID, you're going to be arrested for refusal to comply." Mark, still standing firm, knew exactly how serious that sounded, but he wasn't about to back down. He wasn't going to let himself be intimidated by threats that had no basis in law. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger now, whispers of "know your rights" spreading like wildfire. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what might happen next. A couple of people raised their phones, capturing everything, their voices just loud enough to be heard over the escalating tension. Mark's heart raced, but his face remained calm, a quiet defiance in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the principle of standing up for what's right. Officer Blake stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Mark or the growing crowd. The moment felt like it could snap at any second. Would they make a move? Would the situation turn violent? Mark kept his eyes fixed on the officers, waiting for the next step. He could feel the weight of the decision in the air, and with each breath, it became clearer. Something was about to happen, and it wasn't going to be simple. Just as the air seemed to thicken with tension, a new voice cut through the crowd, loud, demanding, and unexpected. "What's going on here? Why are you harassing this man?" Mark's gaze shifted toward the newcomer, another officer, but this one wasn't from the local precinct. His uniform was different, and there was an authority in his voice that instantly caught the attention of everyone around. The crowd went silent, unsure of how this new development would unfold. Officer Davis and Blake froze for a moment, caught off guard. It was clear they didn't expect backup, at least not from someone they didn't know. The new officer, who introduced himself as Sergeant Miller, walked up, his eyes scanning the scene. He glanced at Mark, who stood just as composed as before, then turned to Davis and Blake. "Why are you detaining him? Do you have reasonable suspicion or probable cause? Because if not, you're out of line." The crowd seemed to breathe collectively, sensing that something major had shifted. Officer Davis, now clearly rattled, opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Sergeant Miller's presence alone seemed to have unsettled him, and for the first time, the officers were no longer the ones in control. Mark could feel the shift as well, but he didn't dare show it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The question now was, who would hold the power in this moment? Would the officers continue to push, or was this the turning point that would change everything? For a moment, the silence was deafening. The officers stood frozen, clearly unsure how to respond to Sergeant Miller's unexpected intervention. Mark remained still, eyes focused on the situation unfolding before him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the potential for everything to either diffuse or explode. Sergeant Miller turned to Mark with a nod. "You're free to go," he said, his voice firm, though his gaze never left the officers. Mark didn't hesitate. He turned and began to walk away, his heart pounding, but before he could take more than a few steps, something shocking happened. "Wait," Officer Davis shouted, grabbing for Mark's arm. The move was sudden, and the crowd gasped. But before anything escalated, Sergeant Miller stepped in quickly, his hand firmly on Davis' shoulder. "You touch him again, and I'll report you. Right now, you've violated protocol." The officers hesitated, realizing the magnitude of what was happening. After a tense pause, Davis released his grip, and Officer Blake stepped back, visibly shaken. Sergeant Miller gave them one final look, making it clear this situation had gone far enough. But just as Mark thought he had won, an unexpected twist hit. A second police car rolled up, and this time, it wasn't just a random officer, it was the chief of police. He stepped out, eyes scanning the scene with a cold, calculating look. "What's going on here?" The question seemed simple, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Mark froze for a second, realizing this wasn't over. The stakes had just been raised higher than he could have imagined. Would the chief back Sergeant Miller's decision, or was this the beginning of something even bigger? The crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move, and Mark knew this was far from finished. The chief of police eyed the situation carefully, and for a tense moment, it seemed like he might side with the officers. But then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded at Sergeant Miller and addressed Officer Davis. "You're out of line," he said, his voice cold but resolute. "I'll be reviewing this incident." With that, the officers stepped back and Mark, still in shock, realized he was finally free to go. The crowd that had gathered erupted into quiet murmurs, many of them applauding the outcome. Mark didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away, his heart still racing, but filled with a quiet sense of victory. In the end, the story wasn't just about standing up to the police. It was about knowing your rights, staying calm under pressure, and understanding that sometimes the fight isn't over until the right people stand with you. Mark's calm defiance reminded us all that one person can make a difference when they refuse to back down.